coming out. I first and foremost want to thank Dr. Chief Toyin Falola for inviting me to do this presentation and the presentations that I was able to do last spring. I don't have a PowerPoint, and this is not going to be particularly entertaining, but it will be blessedly short. It's going to be experimental in the sense that I haven't tried to think through the African diaspora, or the black diaspora, in the terms that I'm going to try to tonight. So I'll be tripping over a few things, and you'll see how I do. I'm going to be reading, which also makes things even more deadly in some ways, but the ideas are unfamiliar enough for me that I feel like I need to have a script in order to be able to sort of make sure that I do justice to what I'm trying to lay out. So bear with me. Like I said, it'll be short, and let's see what we do. I wanna be provocative as well. This has been a provocative time for myself, as you've seen, as I try to work through some of these ideas. So this talk represents an attempt to rethink my lecture presented last spring at the Africa Conference, which I actually enjoyed very much doing. I felt I was on firm ground, and I think some good things got discussed. There I rehearsed a number of conceptualizations of the African diaspora, presented the analytical framework of black diaspora developed over the years here at UT, and ended with a notion of black diaspora as a political and moral project. And hopefully some of you at least were there for that presentation, but this is going to reconstitute that or revisit it in some interesting ways, I hope. Today I want to take a step back and forward at the same time. Back in the sense that I want to explore the ways in which an additional element that has been missing from my analysis of the black diaspora makes those analyses more complete, or might make those analyses more complete, and forward in the sense that the addition of this element to our analysis provides, I hope, a clear path towards the reconceptualization of diaspora as a political and moral project. This is the conceptualization of diaspora I've begun to work with in my own scholarship, and one I concluded with last spring, in last spring's presentation. Last spring I led with the argument that, and I'll read exactly from what I said that both the idea and the facts of the African and or black diaspora are the product of Western modernity, which includes, from essentially, for my conception of black diaspora and others, the advent of global racial capitalism and global racial formation, the invention of chattel slavery and the attendant possibilities of social death, the emergence of black subjectivities from processes of racialized interpolation and experiences, the development of anti-black racism expressed in the process of spatial segregation, forced labor, early death and genocide, the construction of national identities based on the articulated notions of territory, race, and civilization or culture, the possibilities which I insist upon of self-made identities, and the arousal of resistance, cultural, intellectual, and political of the kind produced by activists and intellectuals with access to Western education and modes of communication and travel. Without all of these, there could be no fact or idea of diaspora. Much to its detriment, diaspora is thoroughly modern. Now that's a mouthful, but in some sense what it says is, without global racial capitalism and anti-black racism and all its attendant manifestations, we don't have diaspora in the sense that it's been constructed. And in fact, without modernity, even all those concepts and their connection would not lead to an idea of diaspora. So that's how I led off in the spring. The subsequent notions of diaspora that I developed in the talk were based in this basic understanding. Diaspora is a product of and continually conditioned by the key intersecting elements of modernity, anti-black racism, and the social and economic processes of capitalism, what I just said. This was then a form of intersectional analysis, which many of you have probably heard of, right? But one that had yet to capture a key structure, leaving my analysis incomplete. And what follows, I want to explore what an intersectional analysis of diaspora that includes patriarchy as a primary element would might contribute to the conceptualization of diaspora that I've laid out, and how it affects the notion of diaspora I am most invested in, diaspora as a political and moral practice. Now, my interest in this comes out of my work on black men in collaboration with my colleague Celeste Henry here somewhere here, I think, I saw her earlier, which has been transformed by adopting an intersectional approach with an emphasis on the recognition of structural patriarchy as a key element of modern social formations. Accordingly, I want to begin by providing definitions of intersectionality on the one hand and patriarchy on the other, as I will be utilizing them, because they're not necessarily generally known in the ways that we've been trying to elaborate them. My definition of intersectionality is relatively conventional. Intersectionality, developed by black feminist thinkers and subsequently by others, is a theoretical framework for exploring the operations and effects of forces, structures, and processes of oppression, domination, and discrimination. An intersectional analysis takes as a premise that social structural forces do not act independently of one another. Do not act independently of one another, but in a dynamic relationship, simultaneously and imbricated in matrices and systems of inequality and hierarchical power. Right? So this is important. So it's not just race, yes, class, yes, gender, yes, check them off. It's the fact that these things can't really be understood, at least in Western modernity, without understanding how they're completely interpenetrated, articulated. Thus, an intersectional analysis discerns the particularities of a given force while apprehending its interplay, dimensionality, and intensity in broader systems and processes of unequal power. Specifically, anti-black racism, racial capitalism, and patriarchy come together in a global formation of what Bell Hooks refers to as white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, to describe the interlocking political systems that are the foundation of our nation's politics. That's a quote from her. As an aside, Omoseki Tinsley, Jafari Allen, and others have added to this analysis through their notion of queer black diaspora, which in my halting move forward today, I do not feel adequately versed in to add to my analysis as yet. Although that, you might be back next year, we'll put that in, although I know we have another able speaker by next year. The concept of patriarchy I'm employing is somewhat less conventional. Patriarchy is at once a structural force and the dominant social and cultural paradigm organizing social relations around male bodies, male privilege, the control of women, and practices of domination and control. Patriarchy encourages and rewards a notion of power exhibited through practices of domination and control of self and others. Patriarchy operates through sustaining hierarchical structures and orders of meaning around values of competition, domination, control, and status. Patriarchy establishes relationships, individual, collective, and institutional, grounded in dynamics of power as control over others. It defines power as control and simultaneously naturalizes this order and dynamic. Sociologist Alan Johnson, on whose work this definition is based, states, quote, "A society is patriarchal to the degree that it promotes male privilege by being male-dominated, male-identified, and male-centered. It is also organized around an obsession with control and involves as one of its key aspects the oppression of women." So while it is certainly the case that at the heart of patriarchy is the oppression of women, as Johnson tells us, quote, "The cycle of control and fear of other men's control that drives patriarchy has more to do with the relationship among men than with women, for it is men who control men's standing as men." Now, that's complicated, and it's a little bit, it expands, at least from my perspective, enormously the usual understanding of patriarchy, which is mostly focused on the relationship between men and women. And what this does is talk about patriarchy as a structure which is, in some sense, centrally about the relationship between men and women, but it's also centrally about the relationship between men and the ways in which men, to be men, have to control not only women, but also other men. This expanded notion of patriarchy has been tremendously helpful to me in thinking through many of the issues surrounding black men contemporarily here in the United States. Utilizing the idea that male status is constructed through competition for control of other men, as well as the domination of women, has allowed me to better understand how a patriarchic grammar underpins such things as the construction of alternative standards of patriarchal masculinity by poor black male youth, the intense focus of the patriarchal racial state, the government, on such youth, as we saw in Ferguson just the other day, the relationship between such youth's involvement in competitive male-identified sports like football and sexual assault and domestic abuse, Football as a particular kind of male sport is not separate from the kinds of things that we've seen in the newspapers recently in terms of athletes and some athletes and sexual assault and domestic abuse. In fact, they're closely interrelated if we understand patriarchy well enough. And all these things that I just talked about in terms of young black males, often poor young black males, are closely associated with, in my mind, heteronormative middle-class male respectability. So patriarchy underpins all those aspects of black maleness, and it's been tremendously productive for me to think of patriarchy in this expanded way, to think through those issues in my own research. Now, in thinking through my work on diaspora, and I was doing that when I was reminded early this summer that I was going to be doing this talk, it struck me that my intersectional approach in terms of diaspora was devoid of this third horseman of structural patriarchal oppression. And I wondered whether including it would provide a clearer, more critical analysis of the black diaspora as human experience and social process. So what follows will be very sketchy, and I've been told never to apologize to an audience and all that, but this gets close to that. It'll be a very sketchy and preliminary, but let us see how bringing in patriarchy shifts the analysis of different formulations of diaspora I presented last spring. And once again, this is meant to be suggestive and provocative and really nothing more at this point. So last spring, I started out my presentation speaking about the black diaspora as a historic, demographic, and economic fact. So for those of you who are there, what I tried to do was develop a series of notions of diaspora that also were roughly, could roughly be laid out chronologically in terms of when and how they've been developed. And I tried to sort of show how they led up to a contemporary notion of diaspora that I was trying to develop. So I started out talking about the black diaspora as a historic, demographic, and economic fact. And you all are familiar with this notion of diaspora. It's the transnational, transatlantic movement of 10 to 12 million humans and the transformation of these humans into property, to put it succinctly. Slave trade, all these folks get brought over and they get changed from human beings where they started in Africa into chattel or property where they end up in the Americas. Now this is it's a demographic and economic fact. It's a enormously important one, and it also, just to say it in that sentence, trivializes its enormity, but there you have it. Now, this notion of diaspora as demographic fact is usually associated with the expansion of capitalism and the initiation of the triangular trade. In other words, folks who, sort of talk about or analyze this movement of folks will attribute it to Europe's expansion into the rest of the world, the development of capitalism, and the kind of transportation of labor from one place to another place where there was less labor and therefore a need for to combine this labor with relatively low priced or cost land and the kind of adding of capital to the mix, which gave us chattel slavery. There's a debate around whether the slave trade was also a racial project, at least in its beginning phases. All right? So people like Du Bois and Eric Williams would say, well, slavery began as an economic process and then changed into a racialized process. There are others who want to say, well, from the very beginning it was racial capitalism, and the racial difference between Europeans and Africans was the basis for this demographic movement. However, what should be clear, but also is almost never brought into our analysis, is that the slave trade was definitively a patriarchal project. Men carried it out as part of the male initiative of global male, albeit white male, mastery associated with emerging nationalism, global conquest, enslavement, and colonization. Men predominated the populations of the enslaved in societies where slaves continued to be imported, and hence it's those societies that imported the most enslaved people. And perhaps more importantly, men were even more predominantly the representatives of the master race in these slave societies. Right? So these are not gender-neutral societies or gender-neutral processes. They're highly gendered. These gendered demographic facts must have played an important role in the patriarchal orientation of colonial projects and societies and the evolution of patriarchal politics and structure over time, and in the formation of social relations in colonies that have specific repercussions today. In other words, we are the products of our colonial past in almost every way. Colonial past was raced. It was also economized or based on certain relations of production and economies, but it also was gendered in certain specific ways that must have repercussions on today. Last spring, I spoke of the notion of African diaspora as a racial fact as well. Right? So we have it as a demographic fact. Now it's considered as a racial fact. This is the notion of the African diaspora as the dispersal and the contemporary presence of black racial beings in Africa and in the Americas and other places. This is the notion of diaspora in which one knows where the African diaspora is and who is a member by the phenotypical characteristics of its members. This idea of diaspora creates a strict dichotomy between the whites who created it and the blacks who are its, or were its, proud victims. This notion of diaspora is once again a product of thinking that excludes an analysis of patriarchy. It's exemplified by such political figures as Marcus Garvey. This notion of diaspora contributes mightily to our ideas of black males as the universal black subjects, and as importantly, the universal black victim. In other words, when we think of undifferentiated blackness, which becomes the basis for the construction of our notion of diaspora, we then almost automatically think about men as the universal subjects of that blackness. Right? And that quickly transfers into a notion of men as the universal victims of anti-black racism, right? Almost completely excluding the other gendered possibilities in that construction of diaspora. I also reviewed the idea of African diaspora as a racial condition. This conceptualization takes global racial formation and the fact of global anti-black racism as the key condition of black diaspora, but also neglects, of course, patriarchy. Here, the global social processes of slavery, colonialism, segregation, discrimination, racial terror, and genocide, which recently has become a key aspect of our analysis of diaspora. In fact, many of us are saying that the key condition of diaspora is genocide. Right? Are understood to be constitutive of black diaspora. This is the notion of diaspora of Pan-Africanism, Pan-Africanist scholars, activists, and politicians like Nkrumah, Padmore, Du Bois, Senghor, Fanon. And these men were instrumental in the liberation movements of the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And of course, women's roles in these movements are practically invisible. This notion of diaspora also leaves us unable to understand how such phenomena as the involvement of African men in the slave trade and black male on black, male and female violence, which is such an important aspect of genocide, plays out. In other words, when we talk about the African diaspora as racism, we're often confronted with the fact that Africans played a role in the slave trade. And it's almost impossible to understand how that could be the case if our notion of diaspora and the slave trade is based solely on the issue of race and anti-black racism. But if we combine the other two aspects of an intersectional two other aspects of an intersectional analysis into it, to think about how the role that racial capitalism plays, and then also the role that patriarchy plays, patriarchy as male control, right? Not only in relationship to men, but not only in relationship to women, but in relationship to other men, then it becomes easier to understand how within a system of slavery, black men could be engaged in enslaving other black men and other black women. It's not just an issue of race, it's an issue of patriarchy as well. This thing that I said about genocide and its relationship to black male and female violence is also key for me as well, because I to a certain extent, embrace a notion of diaspora as black genocide. All the ways in which humanity has been denied to black folk, humanity has been stripped from us through slavery and on through apartheid and racial violence and this, that, and the other thing are important. The kinds of things that happened to Trayvon Martin, and happened in Ferguson the other day, and happened in Austin over and over again, I think can also be understood as genocide. But the problem with understanding those things as genocide often is that we have no way of understanding how and why it is that black people ourselves participate in our own genocide. Black male on black male and black male on black female violence is a fact that's hard to understand from a racial analysis. But from a patriarchal analysis, it becomes easier to understand how these things play out, right, in the process of genocide. Because what creates diaspora is the combination of these three factors, right? And patriarchy pits men against men, and certainly pits men against women, black men against black men, and black men against black women in that sense. Patriarchy gives us a way to interpret such difficult problems of diaspora. These phenomena are not about racism, but are related to the intersection of economics and patriarchal processes of control and domination between men of different, but also between men of the same race, men and women of the same race. This notion of diaspora as racial condition is also very close to a notion of the African diaspora as politics of racial redemption. And this is something I also rehearsed last spring. This is again associated with Pan-Africanism and has a long history and associated with processes of transnational black self-making, such as took place in the Haitian Revolution, Maroon societies, quilombos like Palmares, the anti-colonial movements in Ethiopia, Ghana, Kenya, Jamaica, and the numerous and widespread movements of collective racial identity mobilized against anti-black oppression that created moral communities of collective practice and revolt, such as the Black Panther Party here in the United States. An analysis of patriarchy should also help us to understand how and why this notion of diaspora was centered again around black male political figures and black male-led movements. These projects have become part of a diasporic social memory precisely because they are intellectual and modern projects of action, and action is associated with masculinity and men, in a sense. They're also based around notions of redemption and creation of moral communities. These utopian visions were not specified beyond economics and race. As such, they tended to leave patriarchal assumptions widely untouched and naturalized within those visions. Therefore, they were flawed in their goal of dismantling colonial and racial projects as subsequent history has borne out. In other words, the kinds of transformational and utopian projects that were created out of a diasporic notion of a politics of racial redemption have in some sense been doomed to repeat aspects, all right, or negative aspects of Western modernity by their lack of analysis of the patriarchal grammars which underpin both colonialism, but also the anti-colonial movements that these people themselves created, which is, well, I'll leave it at that. One of the most important notions of diaspora that I rehearsed last spring is that of the African diaspora as a cultural diaspora. This is the idea that the cultural diffusion of African cultures to the New World is the basis for the cultural differences and unity of African descended community. This is the contemporary roots notion of African diaspora. Activist intellectuals produced the idea that blacks in Americas have cultural heritage from Africa and cultural practices different from those of whites. And one of the first really big pushes in this direction was the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s, like Hughes, Dora Neale Hurston, Alain Locke. It was also evident in the Francophone negritude of the 1930s with Senghor, Cesar, Damas, and the Puerto Rican Negroism of the 1930s with Schomburg and Ortiz, and of course, U.S. anthropologist Melville Herskovits, and who was influenced by a number of other international scholars. However, the real push for the popularization of the cultural roots notion of African diaspora comes from post-World War II anti-colonial nationalist movements in Africa and the Caribbean that reinforced the importance of culture in the creation of post-colonial nations. These post-colonial nations look to their pre-colonial past for the origins of authentic and autochthonous national cultures, which are one of the key bases for their claims to national sovereignty and their difference from, and therefore right to separation from, the national cultures of their colonial overlords. Our students all love autochthonous. This had a direct influence on blacks in the Americas who looked to the pre-slavery past for their cultural origins as the basis for the emerging cultural nationalisms of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. In the US, and Brazil, and in the rest of the Caribbean. The notion of transnational affiliation based on common cultural origins and practices became the strong basis for Afrocentric politics and the idea of an African cultural diaspora. An analysis of the role of patriarchy in the creation of this notion of diaspora immediately draws our attention to its nationalist underpinning. Since essentializing patriarchic tendencies have also been exclusionary in reading women and queer folks out of the race. In other words, nationalist essentialism, all right, which are based on heteronormative and kind of masculinist notions of the nation or nations and their founders and their traditions, read other kinds of folks out of these traditions and are problematic, and that is in fact what part of the problem was Afrocentric nationalisms here in the United States and Brazil and elsewhere have been. These notions of diaspora as national project are often laced with patriarchal assumptions of cultural leadership as being a male property, and cultural practice being passed through mothers, naturalizing cultural roles and traditions as female. In other words, even these now more or less hallowed notions of the African diaspora as Africa and its diaspora, and based on the tracing of cultural dissemination from Africa into the rest of the world, are based on nationalist notions of identity processes, which are complicit in many ways with patriarchal notions of nation. I then briefly talked about Paul Gilroy, and at some point I stated that I thought that diasporic analysis and theorizing had ended with his work. I laid out a little bit of what Gilroy's ideas were, his notion of an anti-essentialism, right? The idea that diasporic histories, cultures, and politics take place within the context of racial terror, based on the living memory of the racial change, of the changing same, right? So that the diaspora is not based in a notion of Africa as the root, all right, that in some sense creates its diaspora, either through racial or cultural continuities. Gilroy is not so much interested in Africa as he's interested in the connections that he understands to exist between communities in diaspora, And those connections are based on a social memory of racial terror, which is that of slavery and then apartheid and attendant aspects of anti-black racism. But they're also based on a notion of some kind of cultural, not continuity, but relationality, right, which is understood to exist between those communities in the diaspora. So he's interested in the routes between diaspora communities rather than the roots, which are the after roots, which are understood by some to be the source of those diaspora relations and continuity. Gilroy has been critiqued by many for not having a gendered analysis. In fact, he doesn't. When he talks about the Black Atlantic, he talks about male, mostly intellectual people of African descent who create that Black Atlantic. He also has a stinging critique of Black feminists, particularly Patricia Hill Collins, which has led others to make critique, and I won't pile on to that one, or with that one. But the facts of the matter are, Gilroy, as inventive and innovative as he was, his notion of diaspora is also built on the impetuses of anti-black racism and racial capitalism, and completely ignores the patriarchal aspects of diaspora process. So I almost ended my talk last spring by saying this about Gilroy. Diaspora theory ends with Gilroy, especially having revolutionized the field essentially having revolutionized the field, he throws everything into disarray in Against Race, which is his next book, in which he abandons his anti-essentialist position for a merely anti-essentialist one and leaves us unmoored without the familiar footing of a racial standpoint as the sea of modernist and anti-racism continues to threaten to sweep us away. Diaspora theory, which has been the darling, if not the initiator of the post-structural move, postmodernism, post-structuralism, etc., now has an anchor around the neck of those who had championed it within the ivory tower. In other words, with Gilroy's basic move away from his notion of the Black Atlantic in his subsequent work and his assertion that anti-racist identity politics were just as racist as racist identity politics, he undercuts in many ways the move to think about diaspora and diaspora unity, because he basically critiques all the basis for thinking about diaspora as a form of racial continuity or cultural continuity or as a form of unity. And he kind of claims that those are essential and essentializing, and provides the basis for the critique of almost all forms of diaspora thinking. In the face of that, I presented a series of ideas about how diaspora could work as ethnographic politics could be reconstituted based on a notion of notions that have been developed in the African Diaspora program here at UT. But it's essentially, I also ended by trying to think through diaspora as theory and rethink diaspora as racial project. And that's where I'm going to end today. If diaspora, and I claim it is about the creation of moral collectivity, it has to take all forms of hierarchy seriously. So what is black diaspora? Its outlines are still hazy, but they're slowly emerging, at least for me, out of the midst of the modernist past. A product of the modern, it is in many ways the anti-modern, or should be. It is a potentiality yet to be fully realized. It's a call for the recruitment to blackness in an effort to fill the void of genocidal interpolation with processes of self-making that seek to construct a global, black, anti-racist, moral community. It is an imaginary of survival, social, and cultural collectivity in the most expansive and inclusive terms. I'm not sure how adding an analysis of patriarchy to this hazy formulation of diaspora actually accomplishes what I wanted to do. It's clear, however, that if the black or African diaspora is a critical moral project, then a radical analysis of how patriarchy articulates with anti-black racism and racial capitalism is foundational to a moral community that is non-patriarchal. Thank you very much. part of what I was trying to get across, at least in the initial kind of definition of intersectionality, is that all patriarchy is classed and raced, as all race is classed and patriarchized, as all class is raced and patriarchized. In other words, these are processes that don't operate independently. They operate in an interpenetrated, articulated kind of way. So, no, patriarchy is not homogeneous. It manifests itself in all kinds of ways, and it's modified at all times, at least in those other two ways that I was talking about, and probably in many others. I do, however, think that it is very difficult to find it's very difficult to move outside of global, racial, patriarchal capitalism. I think it's very difficult to move outside of a modernist ontology. I think there are alternative modernities, but that world, racial, patriarchal capitalism is a world culture and process, right? So if you're asking if I think that patriarchy is homogeneous, that there are ontologies with other kinds of patriarchies contained within them, my perception is no. But that does not mean that patriarchy is homogeneous. I don't think there's anything outside of modernity anymore. You got, no, don't put him on the spot. There's somebody back there. Yeah, absolutely. That's a nice question. Thank you for it. I did not mean to be making a talk which was internal to the black community, because I don't think there is an internal black community that's not possible. The black community is constituted in the context of whiteness at all times. And I think that black patriarchy, that there is a grammar, a patriarchal grammar that underpins both white and black patriarchy, all right? But I also think that the ways in which whiteness in this country and elsewhere in modernity interact with blackness is in a patriarchal way. So that subaltern males, right, in this case black males, are both seen as a threat to dominant males, but also as female to the dominant male, in the sense that they are to be controlled and they are to be subordinated, all right? So part of the task, if you want to call it that, of white patriarchy is to control other white males, but even more than that, to control subaltern males and all women. Part of our problem as black folks is that since we have internalized those patriarchal norms, we play a role in relationship to white patriarchy, which is quite problematic, which is why there's so many of us in jail and getting killed by the police and all this kind of stuff. But also we play a role in relationship to other subaltern men, and particularly in relationship to subaltern women, which is quite problematic.
I agree with 98% of what you said.
Okay, what's that 2%? Oh, what's the 5%?
But you ended on what to me sounded like on an argument in favor of some kind of anti-modern stance.
Yeah.
And I wonder what you mean by that. Does that mean pre-modern, post-modern? And
Yeah.
well, particularly, what kind of subject position would that be based on, and what kind of subjectivity would it enable? Because if we do look around, there's a lot of anti-modernism going on right now. Let's say ISIS, no?
Mm-hmm.
And very patriarchal at that.
Yep.
Surely you didn't have that in mind.
Nope. You know, and thank you for that question as well. As I went back to talk to my collective back there, I said that I blew the ending, which I did. I don't think there is an outside of modernity. So I think that ISIS represents a particular kind of modernity or reaction to modernity. What I'm calling for in terms of diaspora as a political and moral project is also a project of modernity. I think it can be considered, as Gilroy would call it, a counter-modernity or an alternative modernity. And I think modernity, along with all the bad stuff that I've kind of attributed to it, and violence and colonialism and racism and patriarchy and this, that, and the other thing, also has the seeds of many things that I think are positive, like fraternity and equality and equity and freedom and these kinds of notions. And so what I'm arguing for is the creation of recruiting to blackness, recruiting to the position of the abject position, and making that abject position the position of a counter-modernity, which is a moral position which is as of against racism, as of against hierarchy, as of against patriarchy, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that that can't be contained within a modernity, not the particular Western modernity which is dominant at this point.
One last question. One last. Yes? Okay, go ahead, please.
I was looking there.
This is probably more of a comment than a question, but I'm kind of sitting here and I wanted to see how, if this came up for you in crafting this argument. So one of the things that I was thinking about is kind of the limits of language and the mechanisms we have at our disposal to build arguments. And kind of, I appreciate the spirit of the project, which is to kind of bring in a critique of diaspora in light of patriarchy, or have language around patriarchy within a diasporic context. And at the same time, I found myself saying, you know, as we discuss patriarchy as being imbricated in the system through an intersectional analysis with racial capitalism, et cetera, I also felt like the methodology that you used to present the argument was an additive approach, right, necessarily. But you say kind of, you have diaspora capitalism, you have diaspora and patriarchy, and I was missing this link last year, which I didn't have the pleasure of seeing your talk. I was missing this link, and so I've now incorporated it into this conversation. And so it's kind of more of a thought question that what I perceive to be a tension in the process and methodology versus the actual, I think, really substantive critique and the way in which you recognize that in your talk that these systems are interlocked, but how can we actually identify them and isolate them as objects of analysis responsibly in the spirit of intersectionality is something I'm struggling with.
Well, as you point out, it's something I'm struggling with too, because at least in this talk,
It was presented in kind of an additive fashion, but the spirit is the crux of it, right? Is that can we ever truly, you know, tease these out and identify them as separate entities?
okay, well, there's several things there. I take your critique, and I think that's a reason one. One of the hardest things to do with intersectionality is to avoid an additive, approach to it. And that is clearly, well, not clearly, but I take the critique that that's what happened here. And, that happens, as you said, in the language that I use. Well, I did this last year, and now I'm going to add patriarchy. So that's, par excellence. The other problem is that trying to think through overdetermination is always very, very difficult, because what it really requires is I think ethnography, because overdetermination never manifests itself in the same kind of way, right? So if you're thinking about how things interrelate, the kind of the ways in which they interrelate, and Moya was sort of getting at this a little bit, is always different in any particular moment. So to be able to say something general about it is a very difficult thing to do, because at any other moment, the ways in which these things interrelate and interpenetrate is going to be different, with, different valences and this, that, and the other kind of thing. So I think one answer to the question of how this is done is through an ethnographic approach to it, through a descriptive approach to it, or an ethnographic analysis of it, or what I would call a momentary analysis of it. Right? So understanding that at any particular moment you can describe what it is, but at the next moment that's going to be perhaps different in that kind of way. But I do think it is possible to talk about that. For example, in the work that Celeste and I are doing, we talk about the way in which, say, race and gender are inextricable. And if you think about racism in this country, and you want to think about racism in relationship, just an example, racism in relationship to the African American community, you can say that all blacks suffer from racism, but when you get down to the way in which racism plays out in the lives of black men and the lives of black women, it's very different. There are similarities, but there are differences. And why is that? Because the notions of how it is that black men and black women are inferior are different. The ways in which racialized structures connect with patriarchal structures and class structures to create the context of the lives of black men and black women are different. And so, in those kinds of analyses and those kinds of descriptions, you can show how it is that, you can't really separate out racism, in this case, from gender, because what you get are different things. Racism is different in terms of the way in which black men and black women experience it, because of the way in which, the inextricable way in which race and gender have developed in an interpenetrated way in a society like this. Hope that's helpful.
Be quiet, it was only one last question. I introduced her at the beginning. She's our new faculty, Professor Abenga. She's just joined us from Berkeley, and she does the history of medicine. You want the question?
Okay, yeah, sure, I'll just ask this quickly. Again, a thought question. Thank you for a really provocative talk. I'm excited to see that UT is thinking about diaspora in such rich terms. Now, I'm a historian, and historian of West Africa. It's always been my understanding is that the early slave trade, the production of this transatlantic diaspora was in part due to, if not matriarchy or matrilineal tendencies, definitely a privileging of women in African societies, particularly around the issue of pawnship, or if you want to say slavery, locally speaking, that women were valued for their reproductive value. And so it was almost, if we could say, it was almost a joke, right? So people come from Portugal and they say, we want men to take them from Angola to Brazil. Sure, you can have them. They have no reproductive value. They fetch a high price. This is great. So in a sense, the patriarchy you're describing is the handmaiden somehow to a gendering of the slave trade at the start. And maybe this is a dynamic that shifts over time, because definitely by the 1900s, you would have more female slaves brought in for their reproductive value. But I'm just curious sort of the extent to which it's African patriarchy that's manufacturing the conditions for the slave trade.
I'm not a historian, so the particularities of that are difficult for me to respond to. What I think is that those are the kind of questions that sort of thinking through how patriarchy has operated through time and intersected with racism, anti-black racism, and capitalism bring to the fore. In other words, those then become interesting questions that need to be answered rather than need to be answered in terms of thinking through the processes of diaspora rather than sort of interesting historical tidbits that don't have any real importance in terms of that. it's pretty clear to me that at least from the outside, Western modernity, as it begins to penetrate Africa and the Americas and all these places, is a patriarchal project. It's men who arrive and plant their flags and do other kinds of manly things, you know, for church and nation and loot and all this kind of thing. What they're encountering are different kinds of structures, and the motivations of the folks who they're encountering, at least at first, almost have to be different than those of those who are coming in that kind of way. I think over time, you know, the processes that have taken place over the last 500 years as Western modernity encounters the rest of the world have been pretty dramatic in terms of the ways in which those pre-existing ontologies have been swept away in one way or another, or incorporated, as you're suggesting, into modernity. But, you know, hopefully, I don't have any of the answers here yet. I'm just beginning with this kind of stuff, and it's those kinds of complicating things which I hope people, I know you're already doing that kind of work, and sort of take up and think through in relation to this.
Well, it remains for me to thank you all. Let me start by thanking Ted. This is the third. It's the third lecture we've been able to extract from him in the last 1 year, and we are very grateful that he's able to. I should thank the members of the audience for their patience. And this is very unusual in terms of the patience. Each time we want to do an event, they will say, where would the audience come from? They're always very huge. We fill the BAT stadium, the biggest hall before, with events, and we cannot but thank you. The ASA dancers, thank you very much. And on October 25, we are hosting the first conference ever on African islands. Those islands that are never represented in textbooks, that people don't mention: Fernando Po, Sao Tome, Principe, Madagascar, and all of them. We are bringing formidable experts to talk about all these African islands. And we look forward to seeing some of you on October 25. Have a good evening.